Welcome back to the Human First podcast with me, Adrian Murphy. It's a bit of a special episode today. You'll notice a slightly different backdrop. Today is in fact the 1 year anniversary of the podcast. And I guess we wanted to have a suitably interesting guest to celebrate that. So I'm delighted to be joined by Jim Rowan. And I should say, actually, we're sitting here in the offices of Stack down at the Sky Park. We'll talk a bit more about what that is, but welcome, Jim.
Yep, thanks for the invitation. Great to be here. I was actually here very early on when it first started.
Yep.
Obviously, Paul Wilson and I go way back to our BlackBerry days together when we were reinventing the smartphone or whatever. So it's great to be back. It's always great to be back in Scotland as well. And you know, today I guess we're going to talk about that innovative spirit that should be part of our DNA, but has waned a little bit in the last few years. And so there's I think a fantastic opportunity right now to reinvent ourselves using the technologies of the future. Yeah. So my background has been, you know, I was born in the city. I was born to blue collar family. My older sister was actually the first on either parent's side to go to university. And she did so here at Strathclyde University, and later went on to do a PhD in chemistry. So that broke the mold, and I guess at that point in time, I took a different route. I took a vocational route.
All right, okay.
To start with, and did a mechanical engineering apprenticeship in the south side of the city, working for a company that did heavy industrial equipment. Mm-hmm. And then from there, moved into academia as well, and into the more modern, I'm going to say, technologies, when the likes of Digital Equipment Corporation and IBM and Compaq and those guys came into the country. And that really started then for me a different journey, one which was a lot more international, and it opened up the doors for to live and work abroad.
So did you travel with those companies at the time then?
I did, yeah. So I was lucky enough. I travelled extensively with them, and that gave me a little bit of an insight as to how, specifically around Digital Equipment Corporation, and how a US company actually designed itself for research and development, how they put together engineering teams to work on specific problems or projects or even products. And then I worked for a large contract manufacturing company called Flextronics, and their premise was that they would actually build the equipment for these large OEMs, people like Cisco and IBM and Dell and so on. And again, that gave me an insight, not just to the product side, but it gave me an insight to the supply chain piece, and how supply chains are architectured, and how that's just as important part of product development than the actual design itself. So very fortunate to have worked for some of the world's most innovative companies. And now we reach that point here where we're seeing four things, in my opinion, we're seeing four things combine, four technologies combine. So that's software in all its various forms, silicon, high computational silicon, connectivity, and by that I mean low latency connectivity, and then of course data. And what that combination will enable, which of course at this point in time is AI, is the kind of poster child for all of that stuff. But there will be more to come. So that's why it's great to be in Stack and see, and they're very much at the epicenter of connectivity as well, and smart things.
I mean, it's Stack's so important, building a community here for these founders who just have some of the most incredible ideas of how we harness some of that technology and take it forward. I guess actually we might as well dive into it, because one of the questions I wanted to ask was, you know, you became CEO of one of the biggest brands in the world. How do we nurture those future CEOs here in Scotland? People that might be starting out here, and then finding that their path is somehow blocked.
Yeah, I think, you know, there's two parts to that. For me, one is that the education around the relevant technologies. I'm from the technology side. I'm an engineer, but basically a technologist. And I think technology becomes the great enabler. So first and foremost, I think we need to enable the young talent of today and tomorrow with the relevant technologies of the future. Mm-hmm. And that means the university and college curriculums need to be, you know, fit for purpose.
Yep.
At the same time, we also need to build that character and the character attributes to people. How do people collaborate together? What are the really important things that makes, you know, small incubation companies as well as massive large companies work really well together? Collaboration, communication, you know, the willingness to challenge each other and all of those things. And I think, you know, with COVID of the last few years, that was the fabric of that collaboration was torn a little bit. People started working from home. Younger people were finding it harder to build a network, to build the social skills that you need in order to challenge each other in a respectful way. So all of that stuff, I think, is a really important aspect of how we build the future. And then, of course, you need the funding. So you need access. So I lived in Singapore for over a decade.
Right.
And what I found in Singapore was you had this very, very tight collaboration between government, academia, the finance, and obviously the inventors themselves, let's say. And it was very, very symbiotic in terms of how they built that. The Sovereign Wealth Fund of Singapore, of course, was a great enabler to get that funding to the right channels. And I think that's one of the things we really need to work on in Scotland.
I think that's, I mean, now, you know, if I go back to the founding of Stack, and, you know, back at the start, that's kind of one of the principles here, is how do we bring all this stuff together, because it's so fragmented, probably UK-wide, but we're talking about Scotland in particular, where Singapore has a very joined-up approach to this stuff. We don't. How do we start to
well, I think
that?
you need to design the processes. First of all, you need to if you look at how that works, and if you look at that as a neural network, in terms of how those different nodes within that network operate together and the connective tissue between those. So if you look, if we pick on Singapore have the EDB, so they have their development fund,
right,
or their business fund, if you will. And they're looking for, how do we bring inward investment into the country? How do we bring in the skills? How do we make Singapore a more fertile place for talent to create, invent, using the technologies of today, or indeed inventing the technologies of tomorrow. So that's a big part of it. But they also have sub-funds that go much deeper into the roots. They have A-Star, which is, again, another offshoot of looking for research that's being done in universities, and how do we bring that out of the universities and get that into industry and build strong companies from there. So I think you need to build all this connective tissue together and look at it not as individual nodes, but as part of a neural network that can operate symbiotically.
How, I mean, this seems a silly question really, but how big a role does Scottish Government first and foremost have to play in that? It feels like it would be reasonably important.
They can be a great enabler for sure. I think part of the problem, not necessarily just in Scotland, but part of the problem I think in general, is that a lot of these technologies and a lot of these investments are long term.
Yes.
And by the very nature, sometimes the tenure within government is short term. And of course, there's a huge amount of pressure on government to make sure that they're spending money wisely, and it can be seen, and there's results for that. So I understand the dynamics of that completely. So I think what we need, what would be really helpful to say, okay, this is the immediate stuff, and this is where we need to make sure that we're developing society and we're giving the benefits and the services that we need to give to our citizens, healthcare, education, and so on and so forth. But here's some of the longer term bets that we also want to make. And I think that's where the Sovereign Wealth Fund can come into play. I would be a big advocate for a Scottish Sovereign Wealth Fund, where you can say we're going to carve off a certain amount of that budget every year, and we're going to put that into a Scottish Sovereign Wealth Fund. The rest of that budget obviously goes to service the immediate needs of the population. And if we do that, and we do that properly, and we get proper executives in to run that Sovereign Wealth Fund, because that's not a fund that should be run by politicians. And I mean that in a respectful way, in the same way that, government shouldn't be run by business people. Investment funds shouldn't be run by politicians. So you need to set the framework up for that Sovereign Wealth Fund and say, okay, this is its remit, this is the terms of reference for that. Now you guys need to go and build that. And if you look at Norway is a population very, very similar to Scotland, 5.5 million people, and they have a 1.7 trillion
There's the biggest
What
sovereign wealth
dollars that is, of course,
Yeah.
but it's one of the biggest, and it's a small nation.
Yeah.
And they've done that over many, many, many years. Of course,
Yes.
taking a lot of the revenues from oil,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
redistributing that into, and it's paid, it's paid dividends, not just for the immediate population of Norway, but there's a generational benefit to that as well.
It sounds like from your experience working around the world, and there's different cultures and different attitudes towards this stuff. Is there? I take it there's a lot we could learn and bring in terms of best practice.
Yeah, and this is where some of the opportunities lie. A country like Scotland with the, I'm going to say, the intellectual horsepower that already exists in the country, tethered to the great learning institutes and colleges and universities and schools within Scotland, tethered further to our history and our legacy of an inventive nation. And we're a hard-working nation. We don't mind getting a little bit of dirt under our fingernails and rolling our sleeves up, provided that the purpose is clear. So I think that's what we need to get back. There's certainly a lot we can learn in terms of the structure, how you can structure things. PIF, for example, the Public Investment Fund in Saudi Arabia is now doing the same thing.
Yeah.
They've taken that. Norway's done that. Singapore. There's many other countries around the world. But that's a big part that's missing for us. A lot of the other parts of the jigsaw we already have.
Yes.
And we just need to stitch them together and understand how academia, industry and government can work much closer together. So as you say, it's not as fragmented as it, and we make it easy to funnel the support, the mentorship, the finance to those companies that are making groundbreaking technologies that will fund the future.
I mean, you've worked in the States, you've worked in Scandinavia, etc. Do you find that, again, the attitude towards that, we at government level is just not there? There's almost I don't think it's explicit, but there's an anti-wealth kind of sentiment that we feel in the UK and particularly in Scotland. It doesn't seem to encourage that kind of aspirational thinking.
I don't know. I mean, I for one, I don't think that, because I think sometimes we can get sucked into the vortex of victim culture. Yeah. And it's not the government's fault. We vote in the government.
Yes, that's very
So
true.
so if you're really looking for change, you've got to look in the mirror
and
you've got to say, what is the mandate for change that we need? So I actually don't blame whatever government's in power at the time. This is it's a democracy, and we vote in the government, and we vote in the government based on their policies. And we as the people who decide that should be the ones who are better informed as to whether we're actually voting in a government that is going to give us long-term advantage as well as the short-term needs. Yeah. And it's a much more balanced approach. And I think we need to be asking a lot more questions around that. What are the technologies of the future? Because in my opinion, the way that this is combining right now, especially around AI in all its forms.
Yeah.
So AI, we're now at Gen AI, we're at Gentic AI, we're going to be at ASI pretty soon, or artificial superintelligence reasonably soon. That's going to be augmented by quantum computing. All of this is coming together at the same time as obviously cloud-based computation as well, in the form of TPUs. This is something that we can understand. We have the intellectual horsepower as a nation. We have the learning institutes as a nation to harness these technologies and benefit from them. But we need to be a lot more curious, and we need to be asking the questions as a society, not just a handful of people, but as a society, why are we not investing in these technologies?
Yeah.
And, it starts with STEM.
Yeah.
In my opinion. So what are the opportunities for young people? What is the encouragement for young people to get them into STEM? Because that will be the wealth creation of the future.
Yeah. And do you think, we talk a lot because of what I do about financial education in schools. Do you think, is there enough of awareness of the kind of thing that you're talking about to start kids thinking at an early age?
Great question.
Some of these careers, technologies, how it's going to look in the future. I'm not sure.
Yeah, I think it's a great question, and I don't think we have stitched that together in a way in which to say, if you look at some of the most wealthy companies or the most successful companies in the world, if you look at what has been termed FANG, I guess back now you you got to add Tesla to that now, I guess. But so I don't know what the new acronym would be, but in a very small subset of companies like Amazon, like Microsoft, like Facebook, or Meta as they're now called, they harnessed the relevant technologies. They understood it. They saw it faster. You know, I'm an ex-BlackBerry guy, and so we were displaced by Apple.
Of course.
Because they saw that this was a product that could be sold to consumers and not just to business. This is a product that the base product itself, the technology within the smartphone, could be used for a lot more than just messaging and data transfer. You know, the application layer that sits now on top of all smartphones was the genius that Apple brought to that whole industry. Where is that inventive thinking coming from, and the monetization of that? And so I think, back to your question, I think it's when we're talking to young people, young talent about their ideas, we need to also be saying, okay, how do you? That's a great idea, but unless you're going to go into research and you actually want to make this a for-profit company and an enterprise which can add value to its shareholders, how are you going to monetize that? And that needs to be baked in much earlier, I think, in the process.
Can I just this my own curiosity? What, and I think other people listening would be interested. What did you learn during that whole process from BlackBerry and moving on from there, and how that all, how Apple basically changed the game? You were there, you were on the ground at the time. What did you learn from that experience?
Well, the same thing happened, and I was too young, so the computer industry happened before, the computer wars happened before I was in the workforce, but I had a front row seat in the smartphone transition. And it went from feature phones to smartphones very, very quickly. And if you had said, even 2 years before, that companies like Nokia, like Sony Ericsson, like Motorola, like HT could be completely replaced by two companies that were never in the phone industry in the first place. And it wasn't hardware that replaced them, it was software. Apple, of course, produced the iPhone in a hardware form, but really the big change was iOS.
Yeah.
And then the second change, and the people who were really smart at that point in time, was two people who saw that quickly. One was Facebook. So Mark Zuckerberg says, it will go mobile. We need to start to prepare a mobile platform. The other one was Google, where they say search will go mobile and that we will lose the search from desktop. And at the time, there was huge resistance to say, the screens are too small, the computational power is not enough, the battery life's not long enough. Everybody will stick doing search on a desktop. So they had the vision to see that, and that's when they brought in Andy Rubin. That's when Google brought in Andy Rubin, and that's when he wrote Android.
Right.
And so, and then Android, Google not being a hardware company, enabled lots of really good hardware companies that weren't very good at software to get back in the game. Samsung, of course, has became the major player on that. But they also enabled Motorola to get back in the game, and so on and so forth. So I think the big learning from that is, when you look at a technology and it's fit for purpose for today, which BlackBerry was, servicing basically an enterprise customer base, they never sold direct to the customer, they sold through the carrier.
Yes.
So they became to some extent disintermediated through that, because you don't have end customer contact. You sell to Vodafone, and Vodafone sells to the end customer, be that a company or be that an individual. Whereas I think Apple took a very different approach. They wanted to own the consumer so that they could learn from that consumer on a constant daily basis. They understood the value of that data and that interaction, that daily interaction with their customers. So those were the big learnings, and but there's a lot of battle scars in that time. There's a lot of things that we missed, but it was a learning rich environment, and I think I took a lot of that forward when I took on the first of all the COO role at Dyson, and then the CEO role. Like, okay, this is a product right now. What will be the product of the future? How can we continue on it? How do we make sure we interface with the customer directly? What is the customer like? What doesn't the customer like? Am I getting unfiltered feedback? And how do I then check that data is accurate so that I can change the product development and get an even better product out?
When you went to Dyson, then were they pretty much exclusively basically vacuum cleaners at that point?
Pretty much. They just started the fans. If you remember the circular fans.
Yes.
And so that was in its infancy at that point in time. And then, of course, we brought at that point, new technology was coming up. Battery technology was improving greatly. So that gave you the opportunity then to have a cordless vacuum cleaner, right? So, and obviously the tension with a cordless vacuum cleaner was always how much can you get power into the brush head versus how long the battery life, right? And if you're living in a home with deep carpets and a big home like in the US, then that was very difficult. So because the battery life wouldn't last long enough to do a clean. However, if you're in Japan and you have a smaller home and you've basically either hard floor or tatami mats, that half an hour runtime and you don't need any more than, 50, 60 air watts in order to suck up the dust because you're not going deep into the pile of the carpet. Then you have a different application. And that's where you can say, okay, this is a market whereby battery technology and cordless vacuum cleaners will work really well until the technology catches up and you get more runtime and you get more power. And eventually, of course, now you see cordless vacuum cleaners, not just from Dyson, but from everywhere.
That's right,
pervasive. But that's really been enabled by the technology development of battery and motor technology. And then it was the same, if you look at air purification, when you go to certain parts of the world, outside, the air quality index is pretty ugly at times. So that was the sell point. So how am I going to sell this to a customer? I've got great technology. It purifies the air. It volumizes that air through the room. So I have the technology. That's great. Now, how do I convince the customer to go buy that? Well, in some countries, you just need to look outside the window and say, what I want to do is make sure the air in here is clean. And so that's fine. You close the windows, you turn on the purifier, and eventually the light will go green and you have good quality air for you and your kids. But if you're selling that same thing in Switzerland, where you don't have that problem, but you have other problems, you have asthma, you have pollen, you have people with hay fever. So you're selling ostensibly the same machine, but you're selling it to a very different use case.
Different
so I think that's another thing that we kind of need to teach the young inventors and the young product developers of today, what are the different applications for the technology that they're developing and how can it be used in different parts of the world. Temperature affects things, of course, as does things like air quality.
And then moving on to Volvo, that was a very different kind of company. I'm guessing, looking from the outside, they were, new technologies and very driven by technology. Volvo is a huge, motor manufacturer, lorries, the whole thing. How did that differ? Almost kind of dirty industries from where you'd been before.
Well, the two, Volvo started 1927, so it's almost 100 years old, and they split the company in two about 30 years or so ago into Volvo Group, which is the trucks and buses and excavators and so on, marine engines, and then Volvo Cars. And so Volvo Cars, which was the part that I was responsible for, again, was saying, okay, the industry is changing. So how do we get ahead of the industry in terms of, and it wasn't just about the move from internal combustion engines to electrical propulsion. That, to be honest, was the easy part. The much more difficult part was software, silicon, connectivity, and data, quite frankly. So how do you have a core computer architecture such as Tesla? So rather than running, because most cars had been designed using tier one manufacturers to provide these black boxes, which they called EMUs or ECUs. And those, about 140, 150 of those black boxes were distributed around the car. Some would run the lights, some would run the air conditioning, and so on and so forth. And they were all connected together through, a common software called AutoSAR. But you had no idea what was inside this black box. It was basically sold to you by a tier one. You couldn't change that, and you had no actual control over that. So it basically acted as as an actuator for that specific function. And then, of course, when Tesla started, and Elon Musk had said, okay, we don't want to go that route. We want to have a core computer architecture where we can control everything via software. I mean, that was a very, very brave and bold move that they made as a young company. And they looked for silicon that was capable of doing that, and they couldn't really find it. So that's when the Tesla guys decided, okay, let's go build our own silicon, which became the FSD, or the full self-drive chipset. And so they developed their own high computational chipset And then, of course, years later, NVIDIA, who had a gaming chipset, said, hey, listen, we think we can pretty much build something very similar off a common architecture that would allow NVIDIA to become part of the auto industry. And that's, of course, exactly what they did. But one of the things I think we were most proud of in Volvo was that there was only 3 companies in the world that had harnessed core compute technology. That was Tesla, Rivian, and Volvo. And no one else had done it. There will be others that follow reasonably quickly, but none of the big German players had done it. None of the Japanese guys, none of the Chinese guys at that point had done that. And so that was something which shows the inventiveness of certain companies. And they have that. And I go back to the conversation earlier. When you have, and Volvo for sure has this massively high intellectual horsepower. How do you bring that alive? How do you harness that? How do you nurture that? How do you get out of the way and let people invent in those things? And so again, that's a good example of using the talent base that you have to create technologies of the future. And I think that's what's opened up here right now. It's a moment in time which will be short. In my opinion, 5 years. You'll have within 5 years, the game has lost or won. You're either going to be at the leading edge of this, or you're going to be playing catch up, or you're going to be left behind. So there is a mushy middle that you can play, that you can still be in the game even if you're not a leader. But you can be left behind very, very quickly, and that's what I think. The UK, and I don't just say Scotland in this case, but I think the UK has a tremendous opportunity by harnessing all of that together. That can be a leader in that field, because there's some fantastic learning institutes in England and Wales and Northern Ireland as well, for that matter, that can come together in this. So I think this is, it's about Scotland, but it's also about the United Kingdom. Now that the decision has been made, whether you agree with Brexit, whether you don't, doesn't matter.
Absolutely, it is what it is.
And so now, okay, in the situation where we're at, how do you bring all those constituent parts together and drive synergy? And I think that's the opportunity that's open.
And so that kind of actually brings me quite nicely to Stack. So what was it that made you decide to get involved, other than obviously knowing Paul Wilson?
And I think always these things start with some kind of personal, either a personal mission or a personal relationship you have with someone. What I saw in Stack was a very young, embryonic form of Y Combinator. And I had been very familiar with Y Combinator and having lived and worked in Silicon Valley for a while. And to think that we could do something like that, I liked the idea, I liked the energy, I liked the mission of Stack, and I liked the technology that they were focused in on in terms of that connectivity and smart things, and how that would mushroom out, because the crust which will be on top of that, of course, will be AI. And so, but it's a great nucleus to start with. So that was the real attraction part. Obviously, I'm from Glasgow, so there was a personal mission there as well. Free education that I received as a kid growing up, is something which you kind of take for granted until all of a sudden you realize how fortunate you really are. And so just to some extent to say, I was given those opportunity of free school and university education. You said, did you take full advantage of that? Probably not. Probably not is the honest answer to that. But now a little
Panned out all right, I suppose.
It turned out okay, but a little bit older, a little bit wiser. I'd say, okay, how can you encourage then young people to really lean in and say, listen, this is a moment in time that can really define the future for those young individuals, but also as a society and indeed as a nation. That's kind of what's up for grabs here, in my opinion. And just having lived in Singapore, a small country, I mean, Singapore is 20% smaller than the size of North Ayrshire. It has no natural resources at all. It was built in mudflats. Mudflats of...
of course.
And so they really had to bring together the whole society for the betterment of everybody. And I think we are, as a nation, we are reasonably collaborative in spirit. We like to win as a team and lose as a team. Goodness knows our the trials and tribulations of our soccer team over the years has battled hardened us towards that. But we take great pride, I think, in winning as a team.
Aye.
And so that I think is the moment in time that we sit in right now.
And do you think the likes of Stack is a good place for ambitious, founders who've got an idea, they've got a drive, they've got a vision, they've got a purpose, they want to, in some way change the world, improve the world. Do you think this is the kind of environment that can support that?
Having seen how it's grown so quickly in popularity and the relationship that now has with some, obviously with government, the relationship have with the likes of Glasgow University and so on, it's great to see, and more the relationship with industry. So it's starting to pull together. Stack is really starting to pull together that, combination between academia, between business and between government, and it sits in its. Although it's small, it's got the opportunity to grow. I think it's a great place for, and it's also not just a good place for young talent to come and get support and help and some mentorship, but also build a network with other like-minded individuals. And the world of I started 2 businesses when I was younger, and the world of entrepreneurship is lonely and it's tough.
Yeah,
and sometimes you just need to be around like-minded people. Who keep your spirits up a little bit, because there's a lot more bad days than there is good days in the world of an entrepreneur, that's for sure. So I think that helps in itself, building, given that even if you're only in 2 or 3 days a week, you've got somewhere to go and just get a little bit of buzz in the office. So that's great. The bigger thing I think that Stack provides is that it provides a beacon for what's possible. That for me is the big thing.
Yeah.
And if Stack can build up and it can shine, the brighter it shines, the bigger that light casts out, and the more of a beacon that becomes to then not just in the west of Scotland, the whole of Scotland, and ultimately the UK. Yeah. And then you can start to see how it could network into different parts of the UK or different parts of Europe and even the wider world. So
it's part of that connectivity you were talking about.
Exactly, yeah.
I think I remember talking to Paul at the very outset, and one of the things I really liked, and it'd be interesting to get your take on, okay, we're very inventive, we always have been, there's a kind of reasonably strong private equity, angel type community in Scotland. However, what generally happens, and I think almost exclusively has happened with those firms that get to a certain point, they leave. And one of the missions here is to try and keep them, Scottish brands working out of Scotland with a base. I mean, of course, there'll be other requirements to go further afield, but retaining that kind of base here in Scotland. How do we get to that? Because that's always, every the brain drain down to London, or you have to go to Silicon Valley, or whatever it happens to be. How do we keep them here?
Well, I think it's more than possible. I honestly do. I just think it relates directly to the infrastructure that's put in place and the opportunities to continue to grow, whether that's new premises, whether it's access to talent, whether it's access to funding. I don't think people say, oh, I would really like to go and, live and work in Silicon Valley. I think they're drawn there for different reasons, and they're drawn there, or whatever part of the world they decide to go to, even if that is London. In London, it's almost certainly because they have easier access to capital.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So how can you make that? And you look at if you look at Edinburgh, you look at some of the great financial institutions that's been built up in this country already.
Yeah.
So there's no reason why that infrastructure of access to talent, access to proper premises, and access to growth capital can't be done here in Scotland.
Yeah.
But again, back to your earlier point, it's fragmented, it's tough.
Yeah.
And so some other places in the world make it a lot easier than it is sometimes here.
You've probably got the company, you've got the companies, you've got the investors somewhere, but always feels like they kind of miss each other somehow. The opportunities,
and the biggest part's talent. I mean, because what we're seeing now is because the opportunities are not as available as they are in other parts of the world, then you get that talent drain coming out of university very, very quickly. And if you don't harness them early, then of course they're already gone. And so how do you keep those bright minds and that energy and pour that back into where I think a lot of the time they would rather be, which is near friends and family,
of course,
and build their business from there.
Does the government do enough? We've kind of touched on that a wee bit, or maybe change that, what more can the government do? We've got this short term, as you say, it's election cycles, so it makes it very difficult to have these longer term projects. Practically today, what would you like to see them do?
Well, I think they can provide. I think the government can provide some of the fabric that stitches it together. But I go back to my earlier comment, which is like government on its own won't solve this problem.
No.
And so you've got to have the right curriculum, teaching the right skills and the right technologies. Yeah. You've got to have the right talent, and you've got to have that right culture, let's say, that wants to develop these talents here in the UK and Scotland. And you've got to have access to the capital.
Yeah.
So I would argue that the access to finance is probably more important than what government can do.
Yeah.
So I would put government. What can government do as a second peg to that? So I think it starts with access to capital.
Yeah.
I think we already have the talent and we have the ideas and the creativity. I would argue that some of the curriculum right now is a little bit outdated in the colleges and universities, and we need to leapfrog that. Yeah. Everything's basically based on math, so that's fine. Let's keep the maths and science and physics and so on. But there's new things that we can be teaching and there's certainly things that we teach right now which are outdated.
Yes.
And we don't need to be teaching them for as many hours as we teach them, either in primary school, high school, or college or university. Let's move through that a little bit and go forward towards the technologies and the knowledge base of the future and get that. God, I'd love to see that getting embedded into primary schools.
Yes,
now. Are we talking about AI in primary schools? Not really. Are a lot of other countries? You bet. Really? And so this is where I think the big difference can come.
Yeah, I mean, it's been a wee while since I was at school, and probably slightly longer since you were there, but I don't get the impression it's changed massively in that time in terms of that.
Hope to goodness it's changed a bit since I went to school.
Maybe. But you know, the curriculum, the core subjects, the way it's taught, I mean, we've had our son go through it. In recent years, it's not that dissimilar to what I did 20
I mean, so
years ago.
Here's something controversial, and it's true. There's a tension here, right? Like it or lump it. Smartphones are an educational tool for the future, and they are the communication tool of today.
Yeah,
and that may start at 6 or 7 or whatever. I don't say it doesn't need to be controlled and it doesn't need to be monitored. Yeah. Of course it does. Yeah. But trying to take that away from young people, and then all of a sudden at 15 say, oh, here's a smartphone, and expect them to be digital native, is crazy. It is absolutely crazy. So, and we don't see that. And that, if that is going to be, that's akin to, when I was at school, you need to do all the workings and you need to do the math, and okay, you can use a calculator for certain things. That changed. Yeah. And I think we're going to go through that same. So access to to really good high computational compute. Yeah. Access to connected devices and not tethered to a desktop. Access to mobile devices and how we can use those mobile devices to enable learning in children without all the negative stuff that comes with that. Yeah. Without having devices that don't have access to things that shouldn't have access to, but have access to the learning tools that would be massively beneficial. But that takes investment, right? And so,
willing,
and the willingness to even consider that. So I think there's big conversations that will be tough to have, that need to happen, so that we can come out the other end of this and say, okay, this is how we are going to educate, and this is how we're going to inspire, and how we're going to engage that talent of the future. Because any country, any business relies, the lifeblood of any company or any culture is the future, is the new talent that's coming in. And the younger that you can inspire and engage that talent, teach them to be collaborative, teach them to be digital natives, teach them to understand the value of basic maths and still being able to do the working on the side and understand how math works, but also be able to create the tools that can do that math equation, which will take you, you know, a couple of hours for that to be done, you know, inside 30 seconds because that's the competition. That's what the competition's doing. So that's where I think the big conversations right now don't quite happen.
That's brilliant. It's really, really interesting to get your views. Just, I mean, you've got such a breadth of experience in this stuff. I think it'd be really interesting to see if any of this is taken forward. I would hope so.
I look at if you look at org charts right now, org charts, you have the CEO at the top, and then you have the C-suite, and then you have it goes down like the pyramid, and then you get this, you know, this baloney around. Oh, we are a servant leader organization, and they just turn the org chart upside down, and they put, and we serve. That's complete nonsense, of course. You just turn, all you've done is turn the org chart upside down. You've not really changed the structure of how the business learns or operates. In the future, I'll go back to my neural networks. In the future, what I think you're going to see, and again, this is maybe controversial, but what I think you're going to see is if I look at a company, I don't know who that company is, and I don't know any names within that company, and I just look at that company, and they show me that as a neural network, I'm going to look at the nodes in that company, and I'm going to say, who's that? And the big node, which is going to be the person who has a lot of responsibility in that company, let's say an operations person, but they're doing supply chain and manufacturing, so that's going to be a big node because they have a lot of responsibility. And then I look at the flows in and out and the connective tissue to that node, to other nodes. And if there's a lot of connection, I'm going to that is the person that's probably one of the most important people in the company. Then I'm going to look down here, I'm going to see the CEO. They'll have a lot of responsibility, but he'll have less nodes.
Yes.
So then the argument is like, who is the most important 10 or 15 people in that company? I guarantee you it will not be on hierarchy. It won't be on a standard pyramid organizational chart. And therefore, then you need to say, okay, who do I need to start planning in terms of succession planning for? Because if this person leaves, I'm in trouble. So where's the next big node that's coming with all of this connective tissue towards it? And the second thing I would add to that would be, it won't just be people on those nodes. There'll be agentic AI. And you'll say, this will be an AI node. It's not a person. It's an agentic AI module that sits and connects with real people. Maybe you want to put them in different colors. I don't know. I don't care, but I know they'll be there. And so how can I build that agentic AI model that complements my physical talent that I have in the building? We don't think about it like that.
No.
And that's how I think we need to start thinking about it.
That's brilliant. That's really interesting. Do you mind if we just kind of touch back on you as we kind of begin to wind down? Well, I always like to try and, with the guests, get some inspiration for those who are listening and watching online. I mean, you know, as you've gone through your career, you've had great success. What was driving you? So obviously part of this kind of discussion is how we think about money and what part that plays. And again, for people here at Stack, at that very, very beginning, they're going to be feeling that, right? So how did your attitudes change as you moved through your career, and what was driving you beyond at a certain point, I guess, the financial benefits?
I think if you're doing a startup and it's you, and if it succeeds, you lose your house or whatever, there's a built-in motivation and that, and the strengths you need to build are quite different from if you're in a big company and you're looking to get promoted and so on. Some of them are very similar, and I think the characteristic traits, how you build character. So we talk a lot about how we build talent. We don't so much talk about how we build character. And I think that's something which is missing in the conversation today. So when I talk to young people and they say, how do I get promoted? How do I get recognized? And so on and so forth. You know, I came up with this concept of the 8 C's of progress. I won't be able to remember all 8 C's at this point in time, but if you run through some of them, you know, and I put it as commitment. And it's just hard work. There's no substitute for hard work. And hard work beats talent, especially when talent doesn't work hard. And, you know, and although that's a play in words, it's absolutely true. And I've saw so many people, and I've worked with so many people who, because a lot of the time you don't need talent. You know, showing up on time doesn't need talent. Being collaborative, being honest, having integrity, you know, your appearance, being smart and respectable if you know you're going to be meeting customers and so on. Investing in personal hygiene. None of that takes any talent whatsoever.
No.
And so I think sometimes we put everything on talent, and some of that is just the hard work that needs to be done because it needs to be done. And the job's not done until the job's done.
Yeah.
And realizing that at an early age. I think as well, collaboration is something which, again, has weaned as we've gone more towards an individualist look in life. And we're seeing that fabric being torn a little bit. And despite what your mum tells you or what your grandmother tells you, it's not all about you. It's about the team. It's about the mission. It's about the outcome.
Yeah.
And being able to fully collaborate, I think, with people is another major. Then courage. Having the courage to speak truth to power, and that brings with it integrity. But also realizing that when you do that, the consequences could be dire. But you've got to be able to look in the mirror. That's a character. That's a character thing. And that builds trustworthiness.
Yeah.
And for me, trust is probably the single biggest currency of life.
Yeah.
Because without trust, there is no love.
Yeah.
Right. Without trust, there is no collaboration.
No
so
relationship,
it becomes
no nothing.
it becomes a real building block. And so those are some of the things which I think are really important that we don't talk enough about.
Yeah.
And even confidence. How you got to trust yourself. You've got to have respect for yourself. You've got to do the things that need to be done, even when you don't feel like doing it. I have this conversation a lot with people saying, "What motivates you? What motivated you to?" Like, listen. Sometimes I had zero motivation, but I had self-discipline.
Yeah,
and there's a massive difference between motivation. If I'm motivated to do something because I like the gym or I like going playing a game of soccer or whatever the hell, I'm motivated to do it. It's easy. When I need to do something that I have zero motivation to go do, but I know it needs to get done, and I know it's grind, and I know it's just like grunt work.
Yep.
But somebody's got to get it done, and if I don't do it, nobody will do it, and the business won't move forward. That's self-discipline.
Yeah.
And that's what I notice. You see that tremendously in sports.
Yes.
You see the people who are out there working hard when nobody's watching.
Yeah, that's where all the hard work's done, isn't it? And it's really interesting you say that. So as you're talking, I'm thinking sometimes you just have to grind it out.
Yep. And I think the previous generation, my father's generation, they went through world wars, they went through rationing, they went through subscription, they went through all that stuff. Did they want to do that? Hell no. I'm sure they didn't.
No.
But it built a certain set of characteristics within them when you just got to get it done. And I think, we need to start strengthening that muscle. Again, we're actually in a good position, I think, in the UK in general, Scotland maybe even in particular. But and that's one of the things I noticed as well, living and working in Sweden. Sweden had the same thing. The Swedish population and the Swedish psyche, they actually like a bit of hard work.
Yeah.
As long as the purpose and as long as it's clear, they'll roll the sleeves up, they'll get dirt under the fingernails, they'll go get the job done, and they'll stay with it until it's done. I think we're the same.
Yeah.
And so, but I don't think we've exercised that muscle as much as we could have, should have in the last while.
Emphasise that a bit more.
Yeah.
That's
especially for the younger generation, right?
I think that's one of, we're just coming to a close here, but that's a topic for another day. I think the understanding of what is required to be successful because of all the stuff that everybody sees on social media and all that thing. You just kind of get it like that. It just happens. You just suddenly one day you're the CEO and you haven't really done anything. That's as you well know, it doesn't work like that.
Yeah, because people look to distill that and say, so what was one thing that you did to become? And it's like, well, it's not one thing, and it's not done in a week. It's it's
the body of work, isn't it?
And what we see now, I think I've been to China probably in the last 3 years. I've probably been to China, I don't know, 13, 14 times, somewhere in that region. Certainly more than once a quarter. And I've been in 8, 9 cities in China, and what I see is that they have that thirst, they have that energy. They have that determination, and learning at speed is at the very epicenter of everything that's happening right now. Yeah. And I think if you can combine that with that thirst for learning, that curiosity, the thirst for learning at speed, with collaboration and building something which has got societal benefits as much as individual benefits, that's a pretty powerful combination. But you got to get that. You got to get the cam wheel started.
Yeah.
And then it builds up momentum in itself, and then it becomes self-perpetuating. Right now, we're moving, but we're not moving fast enough that it's self-perpetuating. So we always need to keep pushing it.
Yeah.
And I think back to my earlier points, I think getting things like a sovereign wealth fund in place that's well managed by people who know how to invest in the right technologies, a combination of academia and government really working closer together with a very strong, clear mandate of what the next 25 years looks like rather than the next 5.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Then I think you have a real opportunity. And I think to some extent Ireland's done a really good job of that. Partly because the way in which they brought in inward direct investment was much more sticky than the way in which we did it here in Scotland. And so there's a lot of learnings out there as to how it can be done.
Well, I hope
better.
I hope you can bring some of that to bear while you're here, and start encouraging the right people to do some of these things. Thank you very much.
You bet. It was a pleasure.
Absolutely fantastic. Some great insights there. Really, really. I fear we could talk all day, but unfortunately, I think you've.
I think I have another engagement.
Schedule, So
great to be here, and congratulations on the 1 year.
I
on
know.
the 1 year podcast.
I can't actually believe it. And people apparently listen and watch, which is even more amazing to me. So it's great. And thank you again for doing this. It was great.
You bet.
Cheers.